Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. A very warm welcome to another session on our ṣaḍ-darśana-s series that is being delivered by Manjushree Hegde for the last many months. Unfortunately, we have not been able to bring out one talk every month at least as originally planned because of the very busy schedule of the speaker. But today's session is very special, and I'm very happy to share with our host and others that this this ṣaḍ-darśana series has been very successful. It has been viewed for many thousand, more than 8,000 views. People have watched this session, so I'm very happy with that. And before we begin, I'll just start a small prayer. सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम् ईश्वरो गुरुरात्मेति मूर्तिभेदविभागिने व्योमवद्व्याप्तदेहाय श्रीदक्षिणामूर्तये नमः. To give a brief description of the speaker today, Manjushree Hegde, many of you already know her. You have seen her talks. She is currently pursuing her doctoral studies in Advaita Vedanta from IIT Madras. She has previously studied Vyakarana under the renowned scholar Mahamahopadhyaya Dr. Pushpa Dikshit, and she has also traditionally studied Vedanta Shastra under Brahmashri Ashwanarayana Avadhani of Mattur. And today she will be delivering lecture on the darshana of yoga. We have in the last 3 lectures she has covered Sankhya, she has covered Nyaya and Vaisheshika, and now she will be covering the Yoga Darshana. So with this very brief description, a very warm welcome to you, Manjushree. I am very glad to have you here. So you can please go ahead and start with.
Thank you so much, Nitin. Very good morning to everybody, and a very heartfelt thank you for tuning in. Like Nitinji said, so far we have covered 3 of the 6 darshanas, and today we do yoga and schedule the other 2 very shortly, hopefully. Honestly, when I was thinking of the list of things to discuss with you today, I felt that the first and the most important thing to do is to draw a distinction, boundary line between yoga as a philosophy and yoga as a tradition of experimental/experiential practice. Mircea Eliade, a very great scholar that I respect immensely, commented a long time ago that any ascetic technique and any method of meditation is yoga. And we see this sentiment reflected in the cultural context of the country. From the very beginning, the word yoga has lent itself to a variety of practices, traditions, and beliefs. So you have the yoga of the Gita, the yoga of the Upanishads, you have the Pashupata yogic tradition of the early Shaivites, the Hiranyagarbha yogic tradition of the Pancharatra Vaishnavites, you have the later Nāthayoga traditions of Matsyendranatha, Haṭhayoga traditions of Gorakshanatha, you have the medieval Siddha traditions, then Aghori Pantha, the Kaula cults, the many practices of Tantric yogic traditions. So these different systems of practice and experimentation freely use the word yoga, which is sort of why G.Larson called yoga as India's intellectual chameleon, because it takes the color and the shape and the form of the tradition that it is used in. So it becomes very important to draw boundaries, to distinguish between yoga as a philosophy, as one of the ṣaḍ-darśana-s, and yoga that refers to, well, any ascetic technique and any method of meditation. So my primary focus is, of course, Pātañjalayogaśastra, which is the system that is included in the ṣaḍ-darśana-s. But I'll try to touch upon the other aspects of other yogic traditions peripherally. Let me share my screen with you. Nitinji, I'm not able to share my screen.
Okay, just a second. You'll be able to now.
Okay. Okay. So, the Pātañjalayogaśastra, the primary text of the system is, we know this, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. The word Patanjali is often split into two components, Patat or Patita, to fall, and Anjali, which refers to the cavity formed by putting the hands together, the hollowing of the palms. So the word Patanjali is often etymologically explained as Patanjaliriti, Patatisma Anjalerithyarthaha. So he who fell into the folded or cupped hands of Gonika traditionally is Patanjali. According to tradition, Gonika, a daughter of a sage, prayed to Surya, the sun god, for a son, at which point Ananta Adishesha fell into her hands in the form of a 7-year-old boy, and she brought him up as her own son, Patanjali. Of course, this is not a grammatically sound derivation, it's just a common popular derivation. Pandit Ramshankar Bhattacharya, an authority on Sankhya and Yoga, argues that it is more likely that Patanjali is the name of a Gotra. This Gotra is not found in the Gotra Pravaras of the very authoritative works, but certain forms of this word are found in certain texts, in the Gotra Pravara Manjari, in the Samskara Mala, in the chapter on Gotras in the Matsya Purana. And grammatical considerations, he writes that it's very possible that Patanjali is the name of a Gotra and not necessarily the actual name of the sage. Interestingly, the name Patanjali is not found in the Vedic literature. It is not found in the Mahabharata. In the Bhagavata, this name is mentioned in the list of Siddhas. Really significant or noteworthy. Very strangely, Patanjali is not a celebrated name in the ancient literature. So an important source of the sacred narrative of Patanjali is the Chidambara Mahatmya, a 13th century work maybe that forms a part of the Skanda Purana of the Southern Recension. This sacred narrative of Patanjali is centered on the story of the sages, the rishis of the Tarukavan, the Taruka forest, in which Shiva and Vishnu appear in a disguised form to test, to charm the ascetic sages. The height of this narrative is when Shiva dances and mesmerizes the entirety of his audience, including Vishnu, with his Ananda Tandava. Later, Vishnu, having returned to his Vaikuntha, he relates this story to Ananta Adishesha, who swoons at the thought of witnessing such a dance. He wishes to see the Ananda Tandava himself. Shiva promises to perform the dance again in Chidambaram. So he asks Ananta to find his way to Chidambaram and take a human birth there. So it is that Adishesha manifests himself as Patanjali by falling into the cupped hands of Anasuya, the sage Atri's wife. So in this version of the narrative, Anasuya is Patanjali's mother. In certain other versions, a Brahmana woman named Gonika is his mother. Either way, Adishesha takes a half-human, half-serpent form to witness Shiva and his Ananda Tandava. So in the tradition of Nataraja temple at Chidambaram, Patanjali is a great devotee of Shiva. What you see here is a panel in the Chitsabha of the Chidambaram temple, which is the stage where Shiva performed the cosmic dance. Here, Patanjali is with the other great devotees who witnessed Shiva's Ananda Tandava at Chidambaram. Sage Jaimini, who stands on the extreme left, Vyaghrapada in the center, and Patanjali at the extreme right. He is depicted in his half-human, half-serpent form, hands in the Anjali Mudra. So post-13th century, this is the standard iconography of Patanjali. He is adorned with 5 serpent hoods, and his body from the waist down is represented as a coiled serpent, usually shown in the standing position with the hands clasped in the Anjali Mudra. Image on the left is, of course, slightly different. Now, for more than a century, academic debates have circled the topic of the identity of Patanjali. There is a Patanjali who wrote the Mahabhashya, that is the great commentary on Panini's Ashtadhyaya. There is Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, and there is Patanjali, the author of a commentary on Charaka Samhita and certain other Ayurveda texts. Question on the table is, are the three Patanjalis, well, three different Patanjalis, or do they refer to the same person? Within the academic circle, no definite consensus has emerged. While most scholars do argue against a single authorship of Mahabhashya, Yoga Sutra, and the Ayurveda texts, there are certain scholars who argue for a single authorship of these texts. My own inclination, in the absence of persuasive evidence to the contrary, is to go with the testimony of the tradition itself. And tradition, since at least the beginning of the 5th century, has identified the three Patanjalis as one. So I'll go with this and say that Patanjali is traditionally understood to have authored the three texts, Yoga Sutras, Mahabhashya, and Charaka Pratisamskrita. The composition of the Yoga Sutra is dated between 200 BCE and 400 CE. It is one of the most widely and most often copied texts in the field of Indian classical Indian philosophy. Today, it is preserved in more than 120 manuscripts across the country, the oldest of which is approximately datable to 1100 CE. These very high numbers simply indicate the popularity of this text, because in the course of time, the Yoga Sutras became so well known even among non-specialists of philosophy. It found an elaboration Magha Shishupala in Ratnakara's Hara Vijaya. In early 11th century, the famous polymath Al-Biruni rendered it into Arabic. Parts of it served as a source for the old Javanese Shaiva work called Dharma Pātañjala. These are just testimonies of the popularity that Pātañjalayogaśastra enjoyed, not only in its own time, but throughout history up to this day of the modern era. The text consists of 195 sutras divided into 4 padas, 4 sections: Samadhi Pada, Sadhana Pada, Vibhuti Pada, and Kaivalya Pada. To be honest, this is a very, very difficult text. In true sutra style, the text is very difficult to comprehend because the sutras are cryptic, they are indecipherable, they employ very specific technical ideas, and there's no orderly linear progression of ideas from first principles to final conclusions. Not that the progression of the Sutra Patha is incoherent, but it is prone to sudden digressions and pivots in topics. So without the commentary, it is very difficult to understand, which is why very few scholars attempt to interpret it without the commentary, the Yoga Bhashya. Yoga Bhashya, or Vyasa Bhashya as it is alternatively called, because it is ascribed to a certain Vyasa. Without this, the text would make little or no sense. The Yoga Bhashya's influence on the study of the Yoga Sutras is immense. The later commentaries almost entirely based on this commentary, and they focus just as much of their interpretive effort on this text as on the sutras themselves. In the recent years, according to some significant scholarship, the Yoga Bhashya is understood to have been authored not by Vyasa, but by Patanjali himself. So both the sutras and the Bhashya is authored by Patanjali. This is the argument made by certain scholars. This is entirely tenable. It is entirely possible. The arguments are very strong. If you're interested in this, you can read the works of Professor V. Raghavan, Dr. Philip Maas. Now, there are at least 20 sub-commentaries on the Yoga Bhashya itself. The most famous, without doubt, is the Tattva Vaisharadhi of Vachaspati Mishra, written in the 9th, 10th century. It is a sub-commentary, that is a tika on the Yoga Bhashya, commentary on a commentary. Another important sub-commentary is Vijnana Bhikshu's Yoga Vartika, composed in the latter half of the 16th century. This is very different from the Tattva Vaisharadhi. It is written from the perspective of Veda Bheda Vedanta. Another very important sub-commentary is the Pātañjalayogaśastra Vivarana ascribed to a Shankara. I'll be relying primarily on this for today's talk because it is probably the oldest preserved and definitely the most informative commentary barring the Yoga Bhashya. So Wessler actually writes, to anyone experienced in dealing with the problems of textual criticism, it becomes plain that the author of the Pātañjalayogaśastra Vivarana knew or had before him a text of the Yoga Sutra Bhashya that is definitely older than that known to Vachaspati Mishra and comes hence much closer to the original. Currently, this is the problem of the study of classical yoga. We do not have a very good critical edition of the text. Very recently, Philip Maas commented, strange as it may seem, even after 200 years of scholarship, Indological research in classical yoga is still in its infancy. This is very, very true. An improved text will contribute significantly to an improved understanding of this very difficult. We do what we can. With this, I think we can turn to the text and philosophy of the Yoga Sutras. Now, Pātañjalayogaśastra is very closely related to the system of Sankhya. The framework within which it operates is very generally that of Sankhya. In fact, Yoga Bhashya, Vyasa Bhashya is also called Sankhya Pravachana Bhashya. We've discussed the system of Sankhya previously, so I don't want to elaborate this, but I'll quickly summarize the basic framework. In the previous talk, we discussed that the fundamental metaphysical distinction of Sankhya is between, on the one hand, the self or conscious subject, Purusha, and on the other hand, the insentient, non-conscious object, that which is experienced, Prakriti. In the Yoga Sutras, the word Purusha and Prakriti are not generally used. Instead, the terms Drashtra and Drishya are used. Conceptually, Drashtra is Purusha, Drishya is Prakriti. In both the systems, the Sanyoga, the conjunction of these two fundamental principles, Prakriti and Purusha, Drashtra and Drishya, this initiates the transformation of the unmanifest Prakriti into its manifest forms. Sanyoga here is not physical contact or conjunction, it is simply Sanidhya, proximity. The mere proximity of the Purusha or Drashtra initiates the transformation of the unmanifest Prakriti into its manifest forms. The false identification of Purusha and Prakriti, of Drashtra and Drishya, of self with that which is not self, this false identification, this avidya is the cause of dukkha, of suffering, and Kaivalya is the cessation of this false identification between the two. It is the dawning of the knowledge of the non-identity of Purusha and Prakriti, of Drashtra and Drishya. The Purusha or Drashtra awakening to its self-sufficiency and purity, devoid of identification with Prakriti. This is Kaivalya. This fully awakened state is called as Kaivalya, literally Kevalasya Bhavaha, aloneness or solitude. And this is the ultimate goal of both the systems of Sankhya and Yoga. In the system of Sankhya, the manifest forms of Prakriti are 23 in number. They include Mahat or Buddhi, Ahankara, Manas, the 5 Buddhindriyas, the 5 Karmendriyas, the 5 Tanmatras, and the 5 Bhutas. So it is a sort of vertical evolution, meaning the 5 elements, the Panchabhutas, are evolutes of the Panchatanmatras. The 5 Tanmatras and the 11 Indriyas, that is Manas, 5 Jnanendriyas, 5 Karmendriyas, equal to 11 Indriyas. These are the evolutes of Ahankara. Ahankara is the evolute of Buddhi, and Buddhi is the direct evolute of Prakriti. We discussed in the previous talk that this list of categories is not a catalogue of the objects of the outside empirical world. It is more likely an analysis of the necessary conditions of experience. I don't want to elaborate on this now because we've discussed this previously. What is important is that in the Yoga Sutras, we do not find this exact comprehensive list of metaphysical categories. What we do find, or the nearest thing we get to a list such as this within the Yoga Sutra, is a fourfold categorization of the Guna Parva, the stages of the transformation of the gunas. Vishesha Vishesha Lingamatra Lingani Guna Parvani. This is the sutra that deals with the 4 levels or divisions, Parvani, that are formed by the 3 gunas, Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. Vishesha Vishesha Lingamatra Lingani Guna Parvani. So the 4 levels or divisions are Vishesha, Avishesha, Lingamatra and Alinga. That is Vishesha, Avishesha, Lingamatra and Alinga. You can see that these terms are rather unfamiliar. They are not found in the Sankhya Karakas. They are unique to the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Bhashya, Vyasa Bhashya, equates this 4-level division of the gunas to the 24 principles of the Sankhya system. The Bhashyakara subdivides the 4 Parvani in such a way as to yield all 23 of the principles that, according to Sankhya, emerge from unmanifest Prakriti. So according to the Bhashyakara, Alinga is equal or equivalent to unmanifest Prakriti, Avyakta. Lingamatra is equated by the Bhashyakara to Sankhya's Mahat or Buddhi. Next, the Bhashyakara places Ahankara and the 5 Tanmatras, that is Shabda, Sparsha, Rupa, Rasa, Gandha, in the category of Avishesha. And then he places Manas, the 5 Buddhindriyas, the 5 Karmendriyas, and the 5 Bhutas in the category of Vishesha. So Alinga equal to Avyakta, Lingamatra equal to Mahat or Buddhi, Avishesha equal to Ahankara plus 5 Tanmatras, and Vishesha equal to Manas plus 5 Buddhindriyas plus 5 Karmendriyas plus 5 Bhutas. So the 4-fold scheme of the Yoga Sutra is mapped onto the 24 categories of Sankhya by the Bhashyakara. And the later commentarial tradition simply follow his footsteps. Of course, this mapping is not very straightforward. It looks contrived, artificial. You could argue that nothing in the Yoga Sutras actually supports this interpretation. There's nothing in the Yoga Sutras that justifies this mapping. But ultimately, it works because the consistency between Sankhya and Yoga on other theoretical matters give us confidence that they are closely aligned in this matter as well. It is admittedly a little frustrating that the Yoga Sutra contains no more detailed exposition of its categories than this rudimentary list. Its theoretical exposition is admittedly very rudimentary in comparison with Sankhya. But the reason is the primary focus of the Yoga Sutra is practical and the primary focus of Sankhya is theoretical. The systems of Sankhya and Yoga are complementary in that Sankhya provides the map and Yoga provides the techniques to traverse that map. Burley puts this nicely. He says, reading the Sankhya Karika in isolation from the Yoga Sutra is analogous to reading the list of ingredients in a recipe without having any instructions on what to do with those ingredients, and in several instances, not even knowing what sort of entity the ingredient is. So we need one to study the other and vice versa. The two are complementary. And since we have already largely covered the theoretical aspects in the previous talk, I'll focus on the practical aspects of this system in this talk. To be sure, both the systems of Sankhya and Yoga advocate the exact same method to achieve Kaivalya. The method is the same. The Sankhya Karikas don't elaborate on it, while the Yoga Sutras do. So according to both the systems, the way to achieve Kaivalya, the way to realize the primordial distinction or distinctness of Purusha and Prakriti, of Drashtra and Drishya, is through the pacification of mental activities. and the consequent engendering of a mode of cognition that is unmediated by conceptual mechanizations. It is through this sustained and focused contemplation that the Purusha's distinctness from Prakriti can be intuited. The Sankhya Karika reads like this. Evam tattvabhyasa nasme name naham ityaparishesham aviparyayad vishuddham kevalam utpadyate jnanam. From the assiduous practice of thatness, tattvabhyasa, the knowledge arises, I am not, this is not mine, not I, which knowledge, being free of delusion, is complete, pure and singular. Here the key word is tattvabhyasa. The word tattva is often assumed by many commentators to be a generic term for any one of the 23 ontological categories of Sankhya, the 23 tattvas of the Sankhya system. So tattvabhyasa, according to them, simply means the practice of enumerating or discriminating between the different categories of the system. This is not justified at all. There's nothing in the Sankhya Karika to validate such a reading of tattva. This expression is best understood in more general terms as the practice of discerning the true state of things. So corresponding sutra of Patanjali is 1.32, tat pratishedhartham ekatvabhyasaha. The expression ekatatvabhyasa is again best understood as denoting the discipline of concentrating single-pointedly upon an object or principle. Really, there's no reason to believe that tattvabhyasa means one thing in the Yoga Sutra and something entirely different in the Sankhya Karika. So in both texts, the term primarily refers to sustained and focused contemplation, which results in a profound intuition of Purusha's distinctness from Prakriti. So the method of disentangling the conflated factors, self and not self, is tattvabhyasa, to systematically discontinue the misidentification with the not self through tattvabhyasa. In quiet contemplative moments, Purusha, the dimensionless point of awareness, withdraws from felt sensations and discerns them as akin to ripples on a pool of water, arising and then dissipating. So Purusha awakens to his real nature of Kaivalya. We'll look into this in more detail now. For our purposes of exploring the praxis of the Yoga Sutras, we can divide the meditation techniques elaborated in it into 4 types, 4 structures of meditative techniques. First, non-theistic form of yoga meditation. Second, the theistic form of meditation. Third, the samapatti. And fourth, the Ashtanga Yoga. Of the 4, the last is the most famous. In fact, Pātañjalayogaśastra is often equated only with the Ashtanga Yoga, and it is assumed that this is the only meditation technique that the text espouses. This is not entirely true. We will look into each of the 4 techniques in turn, but it is important to remember that the aim of each of these techniques is the same: to end the wrong identification of self with the non-self. It is also important to remember that each of the 4 techniques is a form of meditative concentration. At the very beginning, in his commentary on the very first sutra, Haṭhayoga, Vyasa defines yoga as samadhi, which is derived from the root yuja samadhau. So he says yogaha samadhi. So each of the 4 techniques elaborated in this text is a form of meditative concentration which results in the knowledge of the difference between self and not self. So the 4 techniques are very similar in their purposes, their structure and orientation, yet there are subtle differences between them. We will discuss this in more detail now. Let us look into the first technique, the non-theistic form of meditation that leads to samadhi. The sutras which discuss this technique is between 1.2 and 1.22. I cannot possibly go through each of the sutras individually, so I'll give an overview of the 10 sutras. The section opens with 4 sutras that introduce the topic of yoga and define the aim of yoga as Chittavrukti Yoga. Yoga is the cessation of mental activity, which leads to the continuous existence of the subject, the drashtra, in its own form or nature, in its swarupa, tada drashtuhu swarupeva sthanam. Vritti sarupyam itaratra. When the self, the drashtra, does not abide in his own swarupa, it becomes identified, wrongly identified with the chitta vrittis, the modifications of the mental organ. In the next 7 sutras from 5 to 11, Patanjali discusses the 5 categories of chitta vrittis, 5 categories of mental activities or mental modifications. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smrutayaha. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, and smriti. These are the 5 chitta vrittis. Pramana is right knowledge. Viparyaya is erroneous knowledge. Vikalpa is imagination. Nidra is sleep. And smriti is memory. These are the 5 chitta vrittis. In everyday experience, the subject, drashtra, is deluded about its own transcendental nature and identifies itself with the contents that the mental organ displays. So it erroneously deems itself affected by mental contents. The drashtra feels happiness and suffers pain, although these experiences in reality exclusively affect the mental organ and not the subject of the drashtra. The aim of yoga, according to Patanjali, is to terminate the erroneous identification of the subject with this mental organ, which leads to liberation of the subject from the cycle of rebirths and its innate suffering. In the next few sutras, between 12 and 16, Patanjali discusses the 2 general means towards liberation, that is a repeated practice, abhyasa, and vairagya, detachment. After this general discussion, he sketches a specific form of meditation called the non-theistic yogic concentration. I'll explain this in more detail now. I'll take the text of the Vyasa Bhashya to aid my talk. We'll discuss the commentary on the first sutra. This will basically help me to establish the ground for further discussion. So please bear with me if this gets a little technical. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. The Bhashya on the very first sutra is Haṭhayoga. So in his commentary on this sutra, Vyasa writes, Yogaha samadhi. Yoga is, for the lack of a better word, absorption. Yoga is absorption. Such as sarvabhaumash chittasya dharmaha. This yoga, this absorption, is the quality of the mental capacity in all its states, literally all its levels. So in the broadest sense, yoga designates awareness as a characteristic of mental processes in general. However, there are different kinds of awareness pertaining to different states of the mental capacity. These are enumerated by the Bhashyakara as Kriptam Mudham Vikshiptam Ekagram Niruddham iti Chitta Bhumayaha. So there are 5 states of mental capacities: Kriptam, Mudham, Vikshiptam, Ekagram, and Niruddham. The first state, called Kriptam, is characterized by a strong and involuntary connection between the mental capacity and its object. You can maybe call it obsession. We're sometimes obsessed with things that we don't want to obsess about, but somehow it becomes impossible to not think about the thing that we don't want to think about. So the mental capacity is fixated on an undesirable or undesired object and is incapable of becoming aware of any different object. This state is called Kriptam. And it is not a desirable state of mental capacity. It is not conducive for mental training. Such a state, na yoga pakshe vartate, cannot be yogic. So Vyasa places this state at the beginning of his enumeration, at the lowest rung of the ladder. The second state is called Mudham, dull mental capacity. In this state, like Kshiptam, the mental capacity is involuntarily connected to a single object, but its connection to the object is very weak. There is no strong fixation with the object, which is why this is considered slightly above the state of Kshiptam, because it can be trained and be led away from the undesired object. The possibility is there, the opportunity is there. There's a better chance to train this state of mental capacity than the state of Kshiptam. The third state is called Vikshiptam or Nānakshiptam, being fixed to several objects. This is the distracting mind, which is bound to several objects in a short succession of time. The mental capacity is attached to one object for a short period of time, becomes attached to the next when it loses interest in the preceding one. Because the mind is in its distracted state and is connected to several objects, it develops a certain distance or impartiality to its objects. And this impartiality provides it with the freedom to deliberately choose a desired object, which Vyasa writes is the first step of entering the path of mental training and spiritual progress. The fourth state is Ekagram. This is characterized by a voluntary connection of sufficient strength between the mental capacity and a deliberately chosen object. This is the first of the specifically yogic states. The first three are not yogic. This is the first of the specifically yogic states. Niruddham, the cessation, the shutdown of mental processes, is the last of the 5 states, and this is what the aim of yogic practice is. Now, I want to take just a moment to show you the problems that scholars face when they study the Yoga Sutras, the problems of interpretation that has plagued not just the modern scholars, but also the traditional commentators. Let us go back to the first line of the Bhashya, where Vyasa says, yoga is samadhi, absorption. And he says, it is a quality of all the different states of mental capacity, such as sarvabhauma chittasya dharmaha. So this yoga, this absorption, is the quality of the mental capacity in all its states, literally all its levels. Immediately after this sentence, we are told that the different states of mind include Kshipta, Mudha, Vikshipta, Ekagra, and Niruddha. Now a doubt arises. How can all these states, especially the first 3, Kshipta, Mudha, and Vikshipta, how can these states be characterized by Samadhi? How to explain this? Each commentator has tried to explain this in his own way. So, for example, one commentator has equated yoga with the word nirodha, restriction. And after declaring this, after declaring that yoga is restriction of something, of anything, yoga is nirodha. After declaring this, he has argued that in the state of Kshipta, that is, when the mind is fixated on an undesired object, in this state, he argues that 2 gunas, tamas and sattva, are restricted. There is nirodha of tamas and sattva guna. And this nirodha, by definition, is a type of yoga. So yoga characterizes the state of Kshipta. Similarly, in the state of Mudha, rajas and sattva guna are restricted. In Vikshipta, tamas is restricted. So yoga, which is nirodha, restriction, characterizes every state of mental capacity, such as sarvabhauma chittasya dharmaha. This is very obviously a force fitting of definitions, and this is what many other commentators have also done. Vachaspati Mishra argues that the first 2 states are definitely not yoga. Vijnana Bhikshu gets over the problem by connecting the 2nd sutra to the 3rd sutra and reading them together. Bhoja does not address himself to the problem at all. The Vivaranakara argues that Kshipta, Mudha, Vikshipta cannot be characterized by Samadhi, so he argues that the Bhashyakara is wrong. So on and so forth. So you see the differences in the interpretations. We're talking about traditional commentators, not modern scholars. So it's very difficult to say idam itham in any of the knowledge systems. There's a lot of room for debates and counter views. And it's important to know this, especially because unless you work with the text, any text, you will not know this. So I just wanted to put it on the table, that's all. coming back to the text, after this discussion of Chitta Bhumi follows a discussion of the 5 types of Chitta Vrittis. I mentioned this in the previous slide: Pramana, Viparyaya, Vikalpa, Nidra, and Smriti. These are the Chitta Vritti. Please remember that Chitta Vrittis are different from Chitta Bhumis. Chitta Bhumi are also 5 in number. They are Kshiptam, Moodham, Vikshiptam, Ekagram, and Niruddham. These are basically the states of mental capacity, the different capacity for concentrated awareness. Chitta Vrittis, on the other hand, are modifications. They are Pramana, Viparyaya, Vikalpa, Nidra, and Smriti. Right knowledge, erroneous knowledge, imagination, sleep, and memory. I won't go into the details of this because that will make this talk unnecessarily long. So I'll move on. So after a discussion of the 5 types of Chitta Vrittis, Patanjali begins his discussion of yoga proper with the sutra Abhyasa Vairagyabhyam Tannirodhaha. The 2 methods conducive to the cessation or shutdown of mental processes are Abhyasa and Vairagya. Patanjali elaborates on the concept of detachment, Vairagya, in the Sutra 15 and 16. I'm going sutra by sutra only in the beginning just to lay the ground for further discussions. I don't want to make this very complicated, so I'll simplify this later. So please just bear with me for now. Patanjali elaborates on the concept of Vairagya in the Sutra 15 and 16. He teaches that detachment is of 2 kinds, a lower and a higher one. Lower detachment refers to detachment from all things which are subject to perception, like women, food, drinks, the worldly pleasures in general. And it also applies to objects that are known from authoritative tradition, like heavenly objects, heavenly pleasures. The detached mental capacity, even when in contact with these objects, keeps a neutral attitude. It neither wants to avoid them, nor does it want to possess them, because it sees their defect, their transient nature, and turns away from them. The second kind of detachment is called Guna Vaitrishnya. It refers to detachment from everything, the entire realm of Prakriti in the Sankhya Yoga ontology, and it is achieved through Abhyasa. Abhyasa of what? Purusha Darshana Abhyasa or Viveka Darshana Abhyasa, the practice of perception of the difference between the self and non-self. The mind, because of practice of perception of self, understands the difference between self and not self, and therefore becomes detached from all potential objects. This is the highest degree of detachment, and it is obtained only through clarity of understanding, Jnana Prasada Matra, through an unrestricted self-perception of the self. With this introduction, we come to the discussion of the structure of the non-theistic yogic concentration, which is described in Sutra 1.17. The sutra is Vitarka Vicharanandasmita Rupanugamanat Samprajnataha. It is called the cessation, which clearly comprehends its object, Samprajnata Samadhi, because it is accompanied by forms of Vitarka, Vichara, Ananda, and Asmita. So what we have here is a description of Samprajnata Samadhi. The Samadhi, the absorption, which is attained with the aid of an object, with the help of an object, is called Samprajnata Samadhi. In the non-theistic form of meditation, the object which is used to attain Samadhi is not a random object. It is the self itself. This is what differentiates it from the other forms of meditation. In the theistic form of meditation, the object of concentration is Ishvara. In Samapatti, the object of concentration is something of the outside world. In the non-theistic form of meditation, the object is the self. There are 4 key words that sketch the development of the mental capacity towards Samprajnata Samadhi. They are Vitarka, Vichara, Ananda, and Asmita. Vitarka, Vichara, Ananda, and Asmita. Each of the four keywords is characteristic of one phase in the development of concentration. In the first phase, which is called Vitarka, thinking, it is thinking which establishes the connection between the mental capacity and its deliberately chosen object, the self. So it is through thinking, through comprehending the teachings concerning the self, the teachings in the Sankhya Yoga philosophy, this is what provides a basis for the practice of the perception of the self. So in this phase, the self is grasped conceptually. So Vyasa defines this as sthula abhogaha. Sthula means gross, not subtle. So the first phase of concentration is characterized by conceptualization, by thinking, and is therefore gross. It is not subtle. Many commentators and scholars, including Vachaspati Mishra, have interpreted this to mean that the object of concentration is itself a gross object of the outside world. Vachaspati Mishra writes that as a new archer first aims at large objects and then progressively smaller ones, so the neophyte yogi first experiences the gross nature of objects in meditation and then its progressively more subtle nature. For me, there are several reasons why I think this is not very tenable. So I'm relying on Vivaranakara's interpretation here. To me, this seems the most plausible interpretation. Of course, each commentator has explained it differently, so different interpretations are possible. I can only talk about what appeals the most to me. Accordingly, in this phase, the self is comprehended conceptually, and therefore it is called as Vitarka. In this phase, the other three forms of mental activity also exist in succession. Vyasa notes that each progressively grosser level of samadhi includes the others. I've put this on a chart so that it is easier to understand. Each progressively grosser level of samadhi includes the others. So Vitarka includes Vichara, Ananda, and Asmita. Vichara includes Ananda and Asmita, and Ananda includes Asmita. In the second stage, Vichara, the connection between the mental capacity and its object is fixed to a degree which makes thinking dispensable. The sadhaka can draw upon his own insights that he has gained from his occupation with the teachings concerning the self. He does not need to investigate the subject again. This is the reason why vichara is understood to be more refined investigation of the object in comparison to thinking, which is seen as gross. So this is the second phase of concentration. In the third phase, which is characterized by Ananda, the connection between the mental capacity and its object loses its conceptual and linguistic dimension. The self, which in the previous phase was the object of conceptualization, now turns into the content of a direct, joyful experience. This phase is understood to be more subtle than the previous two phases. The last phase is called as Asmita. Asmita refers to individuality, I-ness. This I is not only a constituent of consciousness in this last phase of concentration, but it is a constituent of experience in general. Experience, by its very nature, belongs to an individual who is able to refer to the subject of experience with the pronoun I. But usually, this individuality, this I-ness, is eclipsed by the content of consciousness. The focus is always on the contents of consciousness, the objects of the outside world, never upon I itself. So in the final stage of conscious concentration, the situation is reversed. What happens is Ananda is given up. Ananda, which was the content of consciousness in the previous phase, this is now given up. So what is left is I-ness only. This is experienced as asmita pratyaya matra, as simple individuality. You have to remember that in all the four phases of concentration, consciousness is a consciousness of something. It is being conscious of belonging to an individual. The self does not experience itself as different from matter. It still perceives as the subject of perception in association with this mental capacity. This is why even the ultimate phase, the fourth phase of asmita, is called samprajñāta samadhi, samadhi with content. In the next sutra, Patanjali describes the transition from samprajñāta samadhi to asamprajñāta samadhi. The sutra is virama pratyayabhyasa purvaha samskara shesho nyaha. In order to finish the interaction between the mental capacity and the self, the remaining content of consciousness, that is the experience of individuality, has to be given up. The consequence is severe. The sadhaka, in order to let the transcendental self appear within the mental capacity, clear and uneclipsed by any content of consciousness, he has to detach himself from the coherence of his own existence as an individual. The sadhaka gives up his empirical personality, his individuality, to attain the true self. Now there is an unrestricted self-perception of the subject. Consciousness becomes conscious exclusively of itself, unaffected by even the slightest content of consciousness. This is called asamprajñāta samadhi, samadhi without content. The only reason for a transition from concentration with content, samprajñāta samadhi, to concentration without content, asamprajñāta samadhi, is the self-perception of the self. This by itself leads the mental capacity away from the realm of matter. So it's sort of automatic. So the starting point for the development of asamprajñāta samadhi is the fourth phase of samprajñāta samadhi, that is asmita. The content of consciousness gradually decreases, and there's increasing clearness of the perception of the self. When almost no content is left, the very insignificant remainder serving as support of mental capacity is called virama pratyaya. So Patanjali writes, virama pratyayabhyasa purvaha samskara shesho nyaham. This virama pratyaya is the final experience of the mental capacity, the final experience immediately before the complete loss of content. The Vivaranakara gives an example to illustrate this. He compares this experience to the final flame of a fire which has consumed its fuel. There is no fuel left, but the fire burns for a few moments before it gets completely extinguished. This phase is called virama pratyaya, and after this is asamprajñāta samadhi, a state of being free from content. The mental capacity makes room for the unlimited consciousness of the self. Tada drashtuhu svarupeva sthanam. What we must remember here is asamprajñāta samadhi is not Kaivalya. Asamprajñāta samadhi is the highest state that a yogi can achieve while he is living, but this is not Kaivalya. In the context of Sankhya and Yoga, there is no Jivan Mukti. It is only after death that the yogin reaches the final aim, the complete cessation of suffering within the cycle of rebirths, the complete separation of subject and object, the complete separation of Purusha and Prakriti, that is Kaivalya. This is attained only upon death. After an elaboration of the non-theistic form of meditation, Patanjali discusses the second type of yogic concentration, which I'm going to call the theistic form of meditation. It is a variant of the meditation that we discussed so far. It is elaborated between the Sutra 1.23 and 1.28. In this form of meditation, the chosen object of concentration is Ishvara. In his Bhashya, Vyasa asks rhetorically if there is an effective way to attain samprajñāta samadhi without delay. And as an answer to this rhetorical question follows Patanjali's Sutra, Ishvara pranidhanatva. Ishvara in this system of yoga is not exactly like the Ishvara of the other knowledge systems. Rather, Ishvara functions more than anything else as a practical and experiential tool to provide the sadhaka with a direct glimpse of his true nature. So more than anything else, Ishvara is simply a prototype of an eternally liberated Purusha. Patanjali defines Ishvara as Purusha Vishesha. So the primary purpose of introducing Ishvara into the system is to use it as an object of concentration more than anything else. This is the reason why scholars like Mircea Eliade propose that Ishvara is an experience, not simply a theoretical postulate. Later commentators, however, for example, Vachaspati Mishra, assign the role of removing the obstruction of the evolution of Prakriti to Ishvara. Commentators like Bhojaraja write that Sanyoga and Viyoga of Prakriti and Purusha cannot happen without the volition of Ishvara. But really, there's nothing in the Yoga Sutras or the Yoga Bhashya to justify these claims. Within the Pātañjalayogaśastra, Ishvara is simply a prototype of the eternally liberated Purusha. Now let us look into the structure of this meditation. The first sutra of this section is Kasya Vachakaha Pranavaha. In the beginning of his discussion on the theistic yogic concentration, Vyasa reflects on the relationship between words, that is Vachaka, and the reference of words, Vachya, the Vachya Vachaka Sambandha. Accordingly, he writes that if Ishvara is the Vachya, then Pranava, the sacred syllable Om, is the Vachaka. Vachya Ishvaraha Pranavasya. Further, he writes that the connection between Omkara and Ishvara is not simply a matter of convention. It is not simply symbolic. This relationship, this connection between Omkara and Ishvara is fixed. It is inherent. It is permanent. Sthitosya vachyasya vachakena saha sambandha. And because this connection is inherent, the chanting of the Omkara inevitably, invariably brings about its desired effect. The chanting of the Omkara inevitably, invariably brings about a direct experience of Ishvara. Patanjali writes, Tajjapas tadartha bhavanam. Commentators like Vijnana Bhikshu speak of fixing the mind on a divine form of Ishvara, such as that of Vishnu, maybe some pratima, perhaps from a temple, or a favorite artistic rendition. He writes that when the mind is fixed on a gross prakritic form, such as a deity, it is Vitarka Samadhi. And when it is fixed on a more subtle prakritic form, such as Vishnu's characteristics, it is Vichara Samadhi, and so on and so forth. Again, nothing in the Yoga Sutras or the Yoga Bhashya to justify this reading. For Patanjali and Vyasa, the only Vachaka of Ishvara is the Pranava. So in this form of meditation, the method of attaining Samprajñata Samadhi is by chanting Omkara. The sadhaka who has thoroughly understood that Ishvara is the Vachya and the Omkara is its Vachaka, chants the Omkara and makes its referent visible. Initially, the mantra repetition establishes an orientation of the mind towards Ishvara. Once this orientation is secured, the sadhaka practices a meditative vision, the dhyana of Ishvara, that is Omkara. Gradually, when his mind is undistracted and the vision has become solid, he takes up an internalized form of mantra repetition. This increases the clearness of the vision, and the clarity increases gradually until finally only Ishvara is the content of consciousness. Then the mental capacity of the sadhaka has attained one-pointedness or samprajñata samadhi. We can easily see the similarity between the non-theistic yogic concentration and its theistic variant. The states of the mental capacity are identical in both cases in that they both have a single content. In the first case, it is the individual self, the I. And in the theistic variant, the content of consciousness is Ishvara. And if we remember that the concept of Ishvara is simply Purusha Vishesha, the difference is practically reduced to nothing because both are identical in nature. This is why Patanjali says that from the mantra repetition and direct perception of Ishvara, the sadhaka acquires the realization of his own self, he realizes that as Ishvara is Shuddha, Prasanna, Kevala, and free from suffering, so also is myself here. Pratisamvedi Madiyaha Purushaha. Of course, it is important to remember that the sadhaka's realization that his own self is identical in nature with Ishvara is not some knowledge gained by conceptual thinking. It is gained by direct experience. We must remember this. In the theistic yogic concentration, the transition from samprajñāta samadhi to asamprajñāta samadhi is similar to the process in the non-theistic form of meditation. In the beginning, the self experiences Ishvara as a content of consciousness. So in the course of meditation, this content of consciousness gradually decreases. The image of Ishvara becomes weaker and weaker until finally all the mental processes shut down and the mental capacity allows for an unrestricted self-perception of the self. Asamprajñāta samadhi. In the interest of time, we move now to the third type of meditation, samapatti. Before discussing the specific form of yogic concentration, Patanjali turns to methods of establishing an initial stability, sthiti of the mental organ. This is required for practicing the complex form of meditation, samapatti. Now, there are multiple ways to quell the mind, to quieten the mind, and Patanjali describes a few. I've put them in the form of bullet points. In the interest of time, I'll simply read these points out loud and not enter into a more elaborate discussion of these points because they are quite self-evident, really. So Patanjali writes, stability or lucidity of mind arises by practicing maitri towards those who are happy, karuna towards those who are in pain, sukha towards the virtuous, and dukkha towards the non-virtuous. Or stability of mind is gained by control of breath. Or focus on a particular or specific object can cause steadiness of the mind. Or steadiness of mind is gained when the functioning of awareness is free from grief and is brilliantly clear. Or the mind becomes steady when the contents of awareness are free from attachment. Or steadiness of mind is gained through focusing on the contents of knowledge derived from sleep or dreams. Or it is attained by meditation upon anything of one's own inclination. Different methods, just options. It goes on or. After this enumeration, Patanjali writes, Kshinavrittehe abhijatasyeva manehe grahitra grahana grahyeshu tatstha samapattihi. Samapatti occurs when the mind becomes just like a transparent jewel, taking the form of whatever object is placed before it. In this sutra is described the samapatti meditation. In this type of meditation, the chosen object of concentration is an external object. External, not necessarily of the external world, literally, external to the self. So Vyasa, the Bhashakara, enumerates many objects that could potentially function as supports of contemplation, like specific body parts, like the tip of the nose, tip of the tongue, the lotus chakra in the heart that he calls Hridaya Pundarika, etc. So when the activity of the mind is lessened, Kshinavrittehe, it becomes like a fine transparent jewel, a sparkling transparent mani. Abhijatasya iva manehe. Such a transparent mind takes on the color of whatever is situated near it. Tatsthatat anjanata. Just as a crystal reflects the color of whatever object is placed adjacent to it, so too the quiet, unperturbed, fixed mind is colored anjanata by the object that it is focused upon, which means that in advanced meditation, the still mind assumes the form of the object that it is focused on. Vyasa repeatedly states that regardless of the chosen object for the meditation, in samapatti, the mind, chitta, becomes the resemblance, abhasam, of the object of focus's own form, swarupa. To put it differently, the mind appears nirbhasate with the image akarena, of the very form swarupa of the object. In other words, in samapatti, the mind becomes indistinguishable from its object of focus. There's a complete erasure of any underlying sense of distinction between the object of meditation and the perceiving mind. Vyasa makes this point somewhat more forcefully at the end of his commentary on this sutra, where he describes samapatti as apatti, transformation of the mind into the image of the object upon which it rests. Sthitasya tadakarapattihi sa samapattir ityuchyate. Like the gem that is so clear that it becomes undetectable as something separate from the object that it reflects, the mind's activity has diminished to such an extent that it becomes undetectable as something separate from the object that it presents. So ultimately, in samapatti, the mind is no longer understood as the perceiving subject, but rather as something objective in its own way, because in a way, it is no longer internal but external. Put differently, the dividing line between subject and object ceases to be that between chitta, the mind, and a perceptual object. Both lie on the side of the object. So the only subject is Purusha alone. This is the samapatti form of meditation. To highlight the differences between samapatti form of meditation and the theistic and non-theistic forms that we discussed previously, the object of concentration is different in the different forms of meditation. In the non-theistic yogic concentration, the object of focus was the self itself. In the theistic variant, the object of focus is Ishvara. And in samapatti meditation, the object of focus is an entity that belongs to the realm of matter. We can classify the theistic and non-theistic forms of meditation into one group and classify the samapatti meditation separately on account of the differences in their respective structures. The non-theistic yogic concentration is accompanied by vitarka and vichara. The self is contemplated upon, and this leads to samprajñāta samadhi. In the theistic variant, japa of the pranava becomes the means to attain samprajñāta samadhi. In both these types of yogic concentration, there's a gradual reduction of the contents of consciousness until the subject reaches an unrestricted self-perception. On the other hand, in the samapatti meditation, there is no vitarka or vichara or japa, etc. The attention of the mind is simply directed to a particular object of the outside world. The object of focus is concentrated upon very intensely until it is gradually reduced or resolved to its underlying deep structure. The quiet mind acquires the swarupa of the object itself. The object therefore ceases to be an object of consciousness at all, and thus makes room for the self-perception of the subject. Ultimately, the three types of yogic concentration are identical in their results. Their approach to this end result is different. That is all. All these three types of yogic concentration are described in the very first pada of the Yoga Sutra, in the Samadhi pada. We now move to the second pada, the Sadhana pada, in which Patanjali describes a specific form of yogic practice called the Kriya Yoga. And then he describes the Ashtanga Yoga towards the end of this pada. We will first briefly discuss the Kriya Yoga. In the recent years, the word Kriya Yoga has become associated with Babaji and Paramahamsa Yogananda. But this is not what Patanjali is referring to. Within the context of the Yoga Sutras, Kriya Yoga has three dimensions to it: Tapasvadhyaya and Ishvara Pranidhana. Patanjali writes, Tapasvadhyayeshvara Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga. Primarily, this is a preparatory step that aids yogic concentration, particularly the Ashtanga Yoga. Vyasa, in his opening statements, asks a rhetorical question. Katham vyuthita chittopi yoga yuktaha syat. How does a person whose mind is distracted, not fixed, how can such a person practice yoga? As an answer to this question follows Patanjali's Sutra, Tapasvadhyayeshvara Pranidhanani. Patanjali has suggested preparatory steps for the other forms of meditation also. Before elaborating the non-theistic and theistic forms of meditation, he stressed upon the preparatory steps of Vairagya and Abhyasa of Purusha Darshana. Before elaborating the Samapatti form of meditation, he stressed upon the different preparatory methods for purification of the mental organ. Given that these preparatory practices require a certain degree of discipline, a predominance of sattva, and are therefore difficult to practice for a very active, outgoing mind dominated by rajas or tamas. So for a mind like this is prescribed the Kriya Yoga. The purpose of practicing Kriya Yoga is twofold. A, for the sake of supporting meditative absorption, samadhi bhavanarthaha, and B, for the sake of weakening the afflictions that cause bondage and suffering in the cycle of rebirth. Klesha tanukaranarthascha. The afflictions are called kleshas. Etymologically, klesha is derived from the root klesha vibhadhani, which refers to torment, to trouble, to cause pain, etc. So the word klesha is often translated as obstacles that obstruct Purusha from realizing its true nature and entangling it in the cycle of pain and suffering. The kleshas are 5 in number. They are avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. That is ignorance or misconception, sense of I or egoity, craving or attachment, aversion, and self-preservation. These are the 5 kleshas that bind the Purusha into the cycle of rebirth. Of the 5, the first, namely ignorance, avidya, is the most basic or fundamental affliction. It is the mistaken apprehension of self as not self, and vice versa. What is changeless, eternal, pure, and conscious is mistaken for that which is changing, which is not eternal or pure or conscious. Patanjali writes that this avidya is the kshetra, the field from which the other mental afflictions grow. It is the breeding ground of the other kleshas. It provides the basic context for the subsequent 4 kleshas of asmita, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. Asmita is the sense of I, egoity. Raga is craving or attachment to pleasure. Dvesha is aversion, and abhinivesha is the instinct for self-preservation. These 5 kleshas are the root of the latent deposit of karma. Klesha mulaha karmashayaha. So the method of weakening these afflictions is to practice intense tapas, swadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana. Tapas is austerity. It is primarily the control of the senses, controlling the quantity, quality, regularity of food intake, for example, the quality of what you listen to, read, or talk about. In other words, the sacrificing of your sensual engagements. Vyasa writes, Na tapasvino yogaha siddhyate. There's no question of yoga for one who does not practice tapas, self-discipline, that is austerity. It is the first item on the list. Because under the influence of kleshas and vasanas, the mind is propelled towards the sense objects. Since beginningless time, anadi karma klesha vasana chitra pratyupasthita vishayajana. These deeply ingrained habits cannot be removed without self-discipline, without tapas. So it is through tapas that the sadhaka gains control over the tendency to slip back into habitual patterns and afflicted behaviors. Swadhyaya, according to Vyasa, is pranavadi pavitranam japaha. Moksha shastradhyanam va. It refers to the repeated chanting of the sacred syllable Om, or the reading and contemplation of the sacred texts concerning moksha. Ishvara pranidhana, on the other hand, is dedicating all action to Ishvara, to renunciate the desire of the fruits that might accrue from one's actions. It is karma phalatyaga, the karma yoga of Bhagavad Gita, karmanyevadhikaraste. Together, tapas, svadhyaya, and Ishvara pranidhana are called Kriya Yoga, and combined, they prepare the mind of a beginner. The mind that is still turbulent is quietened and made ready to take baby steps on the path of yoga. With this, we come to the 4th type of yogic meditation discussed in the Pātañjalayogaśastra, that is the Ashtanga Yoga. Of the 4 methods of meditation, this is the most popular. The 8 ancillaries or means of yoga, yogangas, of this form of meditation are well known to everyone. They are Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. What is perhaps not well known is that this type of meditation is categorically different from the three types of meditation that we discussed earlier. Unlike the theistic, the non-theistic, and the samapatti forms of meditation, this yogic concentration is initially oriented with the mastery of certain miraculous powers. It primarily conceives the goal of yoga as a transformation of one's way of being in the world. It aims to make accessible the depths of existence which are normally transcending to the ordinary human condition. So in other words, it ventures a construction of an existence in which the yogi is fully the lord of his self and his situation is in possession of transcendence as such. It is only secondarily that the Ashtanga Yoga is harmonized with the philosophy of Sankhya and Yoga. Or rather, it is in the later advanced stages that it aims at Kaivalya, not in its initial orientation. We'll look at this in more detail now. Of the 8 ancillaries of the Ashtanga Yoga, the first 5 are together called the Bahiranga, or the external ancillaries, and the last 3 form the Antaranga, or the internal ancillaries. The external ancillaries are not really concerned with the philosophical content of Pātañjalayogaśastra. They are largely preliminary or preparatory exercises. A Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, and Pratyahara. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, and Pratyahara. Now, Patanjali's sutra reads, Ahimsa Satya Steya Brahmacharya Parigraha Yamaha. I think the word yama is best translated as commitment. So accordingly, a sadhaka must make 5 commitments when he decides to tread the path of yoga. He must commit to ahimsa, that is non-violence. He must commit to satya, that is truth. He must commit to asteya, to not steal. He must commit to brahmacharya, that is a life of chastity. And finally, he must commit to aparigraha, that is to not covet or possess more than what is absolutely necessary to him. Further, Patanjali states that these 5 yamas these 5 commitments are mahavratas. They are the great vows that are universal, that must be undertaken by every person irrespective of jati, desha, kala, and samaya. Jati, desha, kala, samaya, anavachinna, sarva bhauma mahavratam is what he says. We find the sentiment echoed throughout Indian texts, in the Dharmashastras, in the Buddhist tradition, which insists on the observance of the 5 Shilas, Mahavratas of the Jains, etc. So this is a basic requirement as a human being. So for a sadhaka, it becomes doubly important and is therefore listed as the first anga of this form of yoga. The 5 niyamas are Shaucha, Santosha, Tapaha, Swadhyaya, and Ishvara Pranidhana. I won't go into too much details because all of this is quite well known. After listing the yamas and niyamas, Patanjali goes on to describe the supernatural powers and knowledge that arises from complying with these regulations. So, for example, he writes, Ahimsa pratisthayam tat sannidhau vairatyagaha. In the presence of a yogi who is fully committed to ahimsa, who has fully renounced every violent thought, every violent action, in the presence of such a yogi, everyone gives up enmity. The commentators elaborately state that even natural enemies like cats and mouses or mongoose and snakes, they also give up their enmity in the presence of such a yogi. We can think of hundreds of examples of such yogis from our tradition, the life of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the Buddha, very recently Sri Ramana Maharshi. Then Patanjali states, for example, next he states, Satya Pratisthayam Kriya Phalashrayatvam. So for a person who is fully committed to Satya, to truthfulness, the words and actions of such a person will bear fruit. It cannot be otherwise. So, for example, in Abhijnana Shakuntala, Durvasa utters a curse. And when Priyambada apologizes for the transgression, he says, Name vachanam anyatha bhavitum arhati. My words cannot be falsified. They have to bear fruit. They have to come true. This is Vak Siddhi, which is attained by the commitment to Satya. For each of the 5 yamas and for each of the 5 niyamas, Patanjali lists the siddhis that follow upon complying with them. So for the person committed to asteya, non-stealing, sarvaratnopasthanam, he will be showered with wealth. For the person committed to a life of chastity, celibacy, viryalabhaha. For the person committed to aparigraha, janma Kathanta Janma. I forget what it is. I just remember that he can read the circumstances of his past, present, and future lives. Janma Kathanta Sambodha. If I'm not wrong, it's Janma Kathanta Sambodha. In the interest of time, I'll skip each of it because you get a general idea of Patanjali's line of thought. Next, Patanjali writes Khirasukham Asanam. While this is a very famous sutra and is often translated as a steady, comfortable posture, this is not entirely complete because this sutra requires to be read with the next sutra, which says Prayatna Shaithilyananta Samapatibhyam. This is the complete sutra. A sthira sukha posture arises from Prayatna Shaithilya, a slackening of effort, or Ananta Samapatibhyam, from the merging meditatively into infinity. So according to Pātañjalayogaśastra, the steady and comfortable posture is the outcome of two alternative practices, either the result of slackening of the sadhaka's effort or from a meditation by which the mind merges into infinity. If the two sutras are read together as a single sentence, the meaning of the phrase Khirasukham Asanam differs from the meaning assumed otherwise. The primary effect of this is to not be afflicted by the pairs of unpleasant sensations, like that of heat and cold, or of extremities like hunger and thirst. The absence of these sensations enables the sadhaka to take up breath control and subsequently to stay in meditation for extended periods of time. So the aim of asana is to enable the sadhaka to stay in meditation for long periods of time without sensations of his environment and without having to care for food or water, etc. Patanjali himself does not provide detailed information on which postures the sadhakas can perform, but Vyasa lists about 13 postures: Padmasana, Bhadrasana, Swastikam, Dandasanam, Sopashrayam, Paryankam. He lists 13 postures. Then Patanjali says, Tasmin sati Shvasat Pasvashayor Gati Vichchedaha Pranayamaha. Tasmin sati, when a steady, comfortable posture is attained, is accomplished, pranayamaha, breath control, which consists of the regulation of the incoming and the outgoing breaths. This must be practiced. I've put this in diacritics, I'm not able to read it correctly, but bear with me. When the accomplishment of a steady, comfortable posture follows pranayama. This is actually described in some detail with descriptions of different stages of pranayama, but we have 10 minutes left, so I'll skip this portion in the interest of time. Pratyahara is defined as the retraction of the senses from their everyday objects. The withdrawal from sense objects when the mind is under control. The senses are automatically under control. They do not need to be refrained separately. So Vyasa gives an example that when the queen bee flies up, all the other bees fly up along with her. And when the queen bee settles down, all the other bees automatically settle down. So the mind and senses are directly interconnected. This is what he says. With these 5 yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, and pratyahara together form the bahiranga, the external ancillaries of the Ashtanga Yoga. With this ends the second pada. The third pada, the Vibhuti pada, begins with the description of the antaranga, the internal ancillaries of the Ashtanga Yoga, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi, which can be translated as fixation, meditation, and absorption, respectively. Dharana, fixation, is to choose a particular object of focus and fix the attention on it. Desha bandha chittasya dharana. Dhyana, meditation, is the attention or awareness that flows continuously, uninterruptedly towards the chosen object of focus. It does not waver. So this is dhyana. Samadhi is complete absorption. When the mind becomes swarupa shunya, it's devoid of its reflective nature and only the object shines forth as the only content of consciousness. This state is called samadhi. Patanjali, this is of course samprajñāta samadhi. Patanjali refers to this triplet of dharana, dhyana, samadhi with the technical term sanyama, complete control. After describing what Sanyama is, Patanjali goes on to elaborate the supernatural powers and knowledge that arise in consequence of practicing Sanyama on different objects. The key to achieving special powers lies in the application of Sanyama. First, you decide upon an object of concentration. Following the application of Sanyama on the chosen object, you gain a specific power. So, for example, by practicing or applying Sanyama on the Swarupa of elements, the Panchabhutas, from this arises the supernormal power of Animadi and the perfection of the body, invulnerability to properties of these Panchabhutas, etc. By practicing or applying Sanyama on other people's thoughts, you can attain knowledge of their thoughts. You can access their thoughts. You can read their thoughts. You can read minds. By practicing Sanyama on the external form of the body, Vyasa says you can attain invisibility. The attainments attributed to the successful yogi is quite extensive. I've put it on the slide. Ability to fly, telekinesis, invulnerability, telepathy, knowledge of past lives, invisibility, super hearing, X-ray vision, psychic entry into another's body, etc., etc. In academia, there's a lot of skepticism regarding this chapter. Strangely, the traditional commentaries have very little to say about them, and modern scholars have, until recent times, generally sought to diminish their importance or warn about their dangers. For example, among modern scholars, Radhakrishnan tends to see the siddhis as irrelevant, low magical additions to an otherwise lofty philosophy. Dasgupta likewise associates them with the popular misunderstanding of yoga and finds them merely useful for strengthening faith. Naturally, Western academic appraisal of supernormal powers is under the influence of its Enlightenment origin, so they're either suspect or overly romanticized. I think this is not a correct approach. What is so obviously important to Patanjali? To dedicate an entire chapter to it, Vibhuti-pada. What is important to Patanjali should be important to the Patanjali scholar as well. Siddhi simply means success, to hit a mark, attain one's aim or object, to have success. So it carries a very positive semantic range of meanings, from attainment, achievement, success, to coming into force, demonstration, proof, all the way to maturity, perfection, complete sanctification. It does not refer to just supernormal powers. The clear implication of the title of this chapter, Vibhuti-pada, is that this chapter's featured glorification of the yogi is the sign of his imminent final liberation, Kaivalya, which is the title of the last chapter. So Kaivalya follows Vibhuti, Vibhuti precedes Kaivalya. The Vibhuti or Siddhi element is intrinsic to the very structure of yoga. It is in close correlation with the concepts of purification and knowledge. Each implies and is implicit in the other. Progress in one means progress in the others, and there cannot be any progress outside of this organic interaction. So they cannot be in any way separated from yoga's essentially organic and unitary structure. So considering them as spurious elements or useless residues has no textual basis. And I think it's high time that academicians face the text as they are and bring the siddhis into sharper and clearer focus. Ultimately, it is through dropping omniscience and omnipotence, dropping the highest success. Omniscience and omnipotence are considered the highest siddhis. So it is by dropping these that the yogi attains asamprajñāta samadhi in the Ashtanga Yoga also. So basically, in the course of practice, the sadhaka complements the honoring of the commitments and obligations, yama and niyamas, step by step with the practice of the further ancillaries, the remaining angas, that take him gradually to different kinds of mental training and meditation, and finally to absorption. In the ultimate stage of absorption, the yogi gains the liberating insight into the difference between the drashtri and the drishya. With this, we come to the last chapter that deals with Kaivalya. But since we've covered the basic aspects of this in the previous talk on Sankhya, and more importantly, in the interest of time, I'll not enter into any further discussion on this. I'll end my talk here and I'll be happy to answer any further questions that you may have.
Thank you, Manjushree. It was a wonderful talk. So many uh, nuanced aspects are highlighted. Especially, I agree with the fact that how in the academy anything that is out of the ordinary, any talk about occult, siddhi, and everything is completely, thrown as a some superstition and exaggeration. Unfortunately,
Even Indian scholars do the same thing.
yes, unfortunate development. There is a lot of scope to actually investigate these all the siddhis, ashtasiddhis that are there. We have received very 4 or 5 questions. Perhaps you can answer them quickly. I'll just read them out. One of the questions is between Yoga Sutra commentary written by Vyasabhashya, between Vyasabhashya and Yoga Sutra and other commentaries which are independently written. What are some of the conceptual or practical differences which are especially relevant to the practitioners of yoga?
So, like I said earlier, that there is like recent academic scholarship has put the point across that it's possible that Yoga Bhashya is written by Patanjali himself. So the sutras and the bhashyas are very close in their propounding of the Yoga Shastra. Together, they're called as Pātañjalayogaśastra in the recent scholarship. It's not established, of course, but it's possible. I do think that this is very possible. But see, the differences in the different commentaries are a lot, actually. Like each person has brought in his own line of thought. So, for example, Vijnana Bhikshu has interpreted the entire Yoga Shastra in the light of Bheda Bheda Vedanta and has given a theistic, he has brought in Vishnu wherever he can, basically, like inserted Vishnu wherever he can. So, this is their own tendency. See, I don't think it makes a difference for a sadhaka, not too much of a difference for a sadhaka, especially because the sadhaka is not going to read only the sutras and sit for the practice. He's going to have a guru who can shed more light on each of it. And I think if he practices it like that, it shouldn't really make a difference. But as academic scholarship, you have to investigate into the differences. That's all it ends there. Really.
Okay, nice. So one other question we have is both Yoga Darshana and Advaita Vedanta uses the term avidya. So can you quickly explain some differences? Is there a difference between their understanding of the term?
Again, if you're asking from the view of a sadhaka, then I don't want to highlight too many differences because really a lot of it is same. There is the ideas are very similar in both the systems, which is why post say 14th 15th century Advaita also took a certain yogic flavor also. So if you see Panchadashi and certain other texts, you will see a lot of ideas in the Vedantic texts. You will see especially technical words like the Dharma Megha Samadhi that is very peculiar to the Yoga Shastra is found in the Advaitic texts also. So you see this post say about 15th century, you see this in Advaita texts also. So strictly speaking, if you want to say what is the difference, the difference lies in the concept of Purusha and Prakriti. It is not exactly in the avidya. So you can ask, okay, to whom does avidya belong? In answering such questions, there will be differences from the yogic point of view and from the Advaita Vedanta point of view. But for a sadhaka, it is not very important. What is important is that there is a wrong identification with what is not the self. And this is what has to be addressed. So I wouldn't say you should bother too much about the technical differences.
Okay. And one other question is, do you suggest any beginner text for understanding Yoga Darshana? Perhaps if it is a Sanskrit text with a translation?
See, again, I want to highlight the fact that each person has interpreted in a different way. So, for example, the way I have presented it, 4 structures of meditation, another scholar will not agree with that necessarily. Another person might focus entirely on Ashtanga yoga and bring in, say, for example, you can argue that samapatti is nothing but asamprajnata samadhi. Sampradnyata samadhi. You can equate this and connect different portions of the text and try to structure it and present it differently. And this is what has happened. So each scholar has interpreted the Yoga Sutras differently, and this is what the problem is. So if you subscribe to a particular view, you will probably have to read a text that is in line with that particular interpretation. This is not of, like I said, of modern interpretation only. This is how it has been all throughout. The only way it can be solved is if there's a critical edition of the Yoga Sutras itself. We don't have a critical edition of Yoga Sutras. This is so disappointing. This is so unfortunate. And it's really, we should be ashamed of ourselves if we've still not worked on, we don't have enough scholars working on this. This is what we should be working on, really. Producing at least, because see, if there's differences in the sutra itself, if in one manuscript the sutra is saying a particular word and in another manuscript the sutra is different, then what do you do? Which do you take? What interpretation do you take? So all of these become very problematic. So if I have to suggest one work for Yoga Sutras, I like Dr. Philip Maas. It's a Western scholar, so but Indian scholars, there's just the normal translation. There's no I don't know, profound work that has happened is what I feel. So I don't know any other scholar that I can suggest.
One last question. Have the Sankhya and yoga schools at some point in history been presented as a unified school with a new name, somewhat on the lines of how Nyaya and Vaisheshika became composed together and began to be referred as Tarkashastra?
No, that has not really happened. The two have sort of maintained their status because both of them are very strong. As in, Vaisheshika was not complete in a sense that it could be integrated into the Nyaya system because it did not really enter into very detailed exposition of philosophy, etc. It was more concerned with ontology. So it could be integrated into the Nyaya system and not lose, I mean, it could be done. But Yoga and Sankhya are very strong in their own right. They have been developed very well. So one is theoretical, one is practical, and it makes a lot of sense if they're read together, but it doesn't make sense to sort of fit the two together. So no, this has not happened and justified to have happened.
Thank you again, Manjushree. It was a wonderful session. On the behalf of entire Advaita Academy and all our viewers, I again thank you for making time, and we look forward to your next session. I believe it will be on Mimamsa, Purva Mimamsa, and I am personally looking forward to that. Especially Mimamsa is very less discussed subject. Perhaps we could have a more elaborate lecture rather than just 90 minutes, perhaps 2 sessions of 90 minutes. We should definitely plan it. So again, thank you for coming, and viewers. With this, we conclude today's talk, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter for more updates. We bring you more and more live sessions and other things, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Shri Guru Pyo Namaha.